So up until this point, we've assessed a lot of theory. We've talked about Kantian categorical imperative, we've talked about Aristotelian virtue ethics, we've talked about utilitarianism, we've talked about cultural relativism, and various other conceptions of theoretical ethics. And now, because this is healthcare ethics, we need to talk about what ethics looks like in the field. So how do we take the theories that we've talked about and apply them to real-world clinical situations? We've already talked about pluralism and how we have prima facie duties and actual duties, but now we're going to talk about principlism. And recently, in the last 50 years or so, we've actually come up with a pretty good standard of ethics in healthcare that takes all of the theories that we've talked about, so Kantian morality, utilitarianism, consequentialism as a general theory, pluralism, and we've kind of put them all together to come up with 4 principles that we can use in our everyday clinical situations. And what this is called is Beauchamp and Childress's principles, or principlism. And this is the standard that we use in bioethics. And what we've come up with are 4 principles that act as prima facie duties. So again, going back to the pluralism that we had before. So this is derived from pluralism that we can use in healthcare ethics. The first one is called respect for autonomy, and it simply says that people are the agents of their own lives. We have to recognize this, and we have to recognize a person's right to hold his or her own values, beliefs, and goals, and to act accordingly. This is similar to Kant's conception of autonomy, insofar as there is just inherent dignity in all of us, derived from the fact that we can reason and rationalize. And because of that, we have the right to be agents in our own lives. We have the right to have our own values, beliefs, and goals because we are rational people. And more than that, because we're free people, we have the right to act accordingly. And as healthcare providers, we need to make sure that this is something that we keep in mind. The second is beneficence. So it says that we have an obligation to help others further their important and legitimate interests. It's important to note that it says legitimate. Some people have interests that are not legitimate, and as healthcare providers, we don't have an obligation to fulfill those. So defective desires, irrational behaviors, or self-harm, healthcare providers don't have an obligation to further those types of interests, but we do have an obligation to do good, which is what beneficence is, and to further their goals, right? So we have an obligation to help them make sure that their interests are being met and that they have an opportunity to act on those as well. On the other side of that, we have something called non-maleficence. It's the opposite of beneficence, and it just says that we have an obligation to avoid causing harm. So this is the basic principle, do no harm. It seems pretty important to say that in healthcare, since the whole point of healthcare is to do healing. Let's not do harm. The final one is called justice, and it says that we have an obligation to treat everyone fairly and equitably in light of what is due to them. So at the very least, equals need to be treated equally and unequals treated unequal. If you're confused about the difference between equal and equitable, this is a really good picture that I found that helps a lot. So in this situation over here, we have 3 people of varying heights trying to watch a baseball game over a fence. The idea is that they're all equal because they each get 1 box. If we treated them equitably, the shortest person would get the most boxes, the second shortest person would get what they need, and then the tallest person wouldn't. And the idea is that at the end of the day, they're all at the same level. So they can all see the game, and the end result is equality, but in order to achieve that equality, they have to be treated differently because they're not equal in height. So the idea is equals need to be treated equally. So if they were all the same height, we would all give them the same box, but because they're not all the same height, we have to treat them unequally to make sure that they all get the same outcome. In justice, that's super important. And we have an obligation to fulfill that as healthcare providers. So that means that people who need the most care get the most care, the people who need less care get the care that they need, so that at the end of the day we can kind of all be on the same playing field in terms of health care standards. Looking at all of these, it's important to note that just like in pluralism, sometimes they are defeatable, these principles. There's going to be times or circumstances in which autonomy and, say, justice disagree, or they are contradictory, and then we can't actually fulfill both of those obligations. So we have to look at the facts of the circumstances and the prima facie duties that we have and do the right thing. So that's where we get our actual duties from. Again, referring back to pluralism. Keeping in mind that we should always consider these principles equally. No one is more important than the other, although in certain healthcare systems we might value one over the other, but the idea is that generally they're all kind of equal in status and importance, and when they contradict, we have to look at the facts of the matter to decide which one we follow.